Do you want to be
Yeah. Sure. I was wondering what you think about what I consider to be kind of the marginalization of kind of the rural that Jesus went for America in national and mass news media, and how that kind of silence in that whole area of the country. You hear about it when like the coal mining disaster, when the school shooting, a lot, like that. How that plays into the politics part of it, and what role national mass media can play in kind of bringing them into the kingdom.
That's a very good question, and I think is at the root of a lot of the misconceptions that we have, and they're not new. I mean, starting back in '76, when Jimmy Carter talked about being born again, and it was in response to a question he was asked. He didn't just spontaneously decide to tell reporters he was born again. It freaked them out. They didn't know what he was talking about. And one of my famous quotes is from John Chancellor, who was anchoring the NBC Nightly News, showed a clip of Carter saying he was born again, and then felt the need to explain to his audience what born again meant. He said, we've checked this out, and it turns out it's not a bizarre mountaintop experience. It's something common to millions of Americans, particularly if you're Baptist, which I think he thought was very useful information for his viewers, but in fact just made him look out of touch to most of his viewers. That hasn't changed much. And I can tell you, as someone who sits through morning editorial meetings, the impulse is always to cover New York-centric stories. Even for a national news magazine, our readership is in the heart of America, not largely in New York City. To cover things that kind of our echo chamber talks about. And when we do talk about middle America, it's to portray them as kind of these quaint people who live in the middle of the country. We had, I think, a few features last year since I started. One was on state fairs, which is harmless. But that was one of the only times we actually ventured into the country and talked about it. And there they are, eating cotton candy, walking around the fairway. We had another photo essay that was supposed to be about Americans in the campaign. Could potentially be very interesting, just how people are reacting to candidates. But all the photos they wanted to use were of, a guy sitting in his lawn chair at a campaign picnic. I will not name anyone since this is being filmed, but the comments around the room would be, "Oh, that's so Iowa." I'd say, I don't think it is. I think that's just normal American life. And to set that out with some kind of, headline or caption or accompanying essay that makes it seem quaint just highlights how out of touch you are. And that looks like my neighbor to me. And for me to open up Time Magazine and have somebody tell me this is some interesting species is really off-putting. So the same thing, I think, to the nth degree when it comes to evangelicals. And one reason that's been is the only time, until very recently, that evangelicals have kind of bubbled up to the surface is when they do something outrageous. When Jerry Falwell says that liberals are responsible for 9/11. That frustrates every evangelical I know. Even people who may, theologically line up a little closer to Jerry Falwell and to Pat Robertson, they can't stand that those are the guys. He's now deceased, so they've had to find new stand-ins for the evangelical slot on talk shows. But they can't stand that that's the only image that people have. And I think that's really a responsibility that my colleagues and I share, is to really broaden the people we go to. I've said that happened until very recently. I think there have been a couple of changes. One, up until about 2004, if you had a debate about religion on TV, it would be Ralph Reed or Pat Robertson or somebody like that. And then it'd be someone from the ACLU or Barry Lynn, who are great. And they have a good position to represent. But the impact of that is that religion is on the right, and on the left, they just want religion out of the public square. Now they're putting on Jim Wallace, sometimes Al Sharpton, which doesn't help as much. But reporters are learning to add new names to their Rolodex, which is broadening the discussion a little more.
Yes.
Sorry. Related. I know you used a statistic earlier about 85 to 88% saying that religion is very important. Was that all Americans or all religious Americans?
No, that's all Americans.
Really?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's both Gallup and the Pew poll. The Pew asks that question basically every year, and I can get into more details after your second question.
Okay. Yeah. The second question relates back because to me personally, I like to keep politics and religion separate from me, but obviously it's not like that for the majority of America, and so I'm wondering, like, how can Democrats, I guess, appeal to more religious people, but not go so far as the political right has, pushing everything supposedly in the name of God?
Sure.
Because what you were saying earlier about Pat Robertson, Jerry Falwell, that is the image I have of evangelicals, and I wonder how can they appeal? How can Democrats appeal to religious people? How can evangelicals get out this other image?
Right. Both complicated questions,
Yeah,
but no, it's a good question because I am asked very often, won't it just alienate secular voters if Democrats appeal to religious voters? And it would if Democrats use the Republican model. But the good news is that there are many, many ways of talking about religion, many, many ways of, these sit-down meetings that happened in Michigan and Ohio didn't stir up any controversy at all. I think in large part because they weren't controversial. They're just sitting down and talking to voters like they would any other group and like they do any other group. So part of it is just expressing respect for and openness to dialogue with voters who have been written off by Democrats. And I don't think that should or does pose any threat to secular voters. But another point is that it's often assumed that the ranks of secularists are really growing by leaps and bounds in the U.S. And it's true that there are more Americans who identify themselves as secular now than there were 10 or 15 years ago. But it's also true, there was another study done last fall by Baylor University, or fall of 2006, that really kind of probed what it means when people tell pollsters that they don't have any religious affiliation, whether it meant that those people really should be lumped in with the secular label. And in many cases, it turns out no. That if you ask people specific follow-up questions then, it turns out a lot of people who say they don't have a religious affiliation pray fairly frequently. They say they believe in God. They'll even a certain percentage of them can name a house of worship that they attend on a fairly regular basis. I think religion has taken a beating in terms of its reputation, and people are far less willing to affiliate themselves with a religious tradition. But that doesn't mean that they've become any less religious. And it also means that for Democrats to kind of reach out and embrace is the wrong word, but engage religious voters doesn't necessarily drive away a whole bunch of people, because there are very few Americans who think religion should have absolutely no place in the public square. There are people who definitely feel that way, and that's a principled stand that I respect. But as I kind of explained earlier, I don't think it's one that Democrats can afford to take, nor should they, because I think those voters deserve to be heard.
So because I don't know if people make a differentiation between religion and spirituality. I guess I don't know if anybody else feels like that, but I feel like that's the Democratic candidates this year, I think, are appealing to that, maybe without being too religious, in my opinion, I guess. But I think spirituality is an important thing. But
It's very true. Yeah. Well, and there are a lot of people who say, I'm not religious, but I'm spiritual. We haven't really spoken to that either. But I think part of that is also starting to talk in the language of values. This became also very kind of trendy after 2004 with George Lakoff and frames. And we should all talk in the language of values. But there is something to it in that Democrats are so kind of right-brained that they like to think in terms of issues. And, yes, of course, we have values that lead us to these issues, but it's really the issues that matter.